You have an article out right now at VSiN.com called just basically your draft notes from the 2024 draft this past weekend, but it's not what we normally see on, all these other websites of your draft grades and A plus B, but that's not what we're doing here. Can you explain to people a little bit about the purpose of your article this week?
Well, we call this the offseason for a reason. And it's not just the draft. It's the combination of what has occurred for all these teams in the offseason. And that goes for, there's three areas you want to look at every team, and regardless of sport. It's players, coaches, and scheme. And at the end of every season, and you go into your offseason, you have to correctly identify the areas of weakness. We talked about this last year. The Cleveland Browns, they needed to fix their defense. They hired Jim Schwartz, basically maneuvered some pieces around. They played much better defense. He was instrumental. The Houston Texans hired DeMeco Ryans. They hired Slowick to be the offensive coordinator. Really changed their whole franchise organization, along with C.J. Stroud and Tank Dell and some of the players that they brought in. So it's the combination of these events. The draft alone gets all the attention. And what I try to point out in my column was that you have to look at the whole entire offseason before you can really judge a draft. And you got to look at the teams that I thought have done a good job, whether it's hired the right coach, whether it's fixed their one position that was of critical need, and then judge those teams, because what do we have to do as handicappers? Because we're all handicappers. You are, I am, everybody is. You have to give a power rating to the team coming off the off season, not just give grades for that. And the only way that you can actually get the right power rating is to understand what they did in all three areas: coaches, players, and scheme. And that's what I try to do in this column, and point out some of the teams that I think have done a really good job of identifying their needs and fulfilling all of their needs in those three areas.
Yeah, you can't just be a winner in free agency or a winner on paper in the draft. It's about marrying the multiple seasons together into one. I know we talked a lot about the Pittsburgh Steelers over the last 2 days. You really liked what they did, but what other teams did you lay out in the article that you really want to highlight here as doing a good job?
Well, I thought the Rams, and the Rams they're back in the draft again. They come back. This is the first time they've had a first-round pick in a long time. But let's go back to what they did in the free agency period, right? So the Rams decided that they really feel like they have to protect Matthew Stafford. They've got to be an inside zone team. And so what they decided to do was to upgrade their guard position. They put a lot of money in Jonah Jackson from Detroit. They re-signed Kevin Dotson. They said, look, we got to protect the middle of the field. And they moved their second-round draft pick, Avila, to center, which is what he plays, and they fixed that. Great. Okay, and then they've added some other pieces along the way, and then they turned their attention to the defensive board, right? We know Bobby Brown was really good for him last year. We know Kobe Turner was really good for him. Now they add two more pieces, okay? They add Fisk, the defensive tackle, who I think is an outstanding player. They add Versey from Florida State, both players from Florida State. Then they add Tyler Davis, a fifth rounder. So they really upgraded their defensive line. So they worked offensive line, defensive line. They didn't get carried away with, we need another skill player. We need another this. And those moves with the team that they have, they're no longer on the border of are we going to stay healthy enough? They are now improved in the area where they can attack San Francisco and run the inside zone, run the outside zone, because they've got a bigger presence inside. So I like those. I like what they've done in all three areas. Now they lose Raheem Morris. They replace him with Chris Shula. They'll run the same scheme because Shula was there last year. That could be a little bit of a problem, but I think overall I like what the Rams did. I think they really they've closed the gap a little bit. This West, Stormy, I hate to give you this bad news, but I think this West is going to be really a good West. The other team I thought did well is Seattle. Nobody's going to give Seattle an A for their draft. Nobody will, because Seattle's lost a lot of players, but when we come back from the break, we can talk about it. I think Seattle is in really good shape moving forward.
Nobody's going to give the Seattle Seahawks a good draft grade, but you have other feelings. Talk me through what they have done this offseason and why you think that they could be a team on the up and up.
Well, look, I'm a Pete Carroll fan, and I like Pete, and I think Pete belongs in the Hall of Fame. But I think Pete's inability to kind of fix their defense last year was a huge concern. And part of the problem was they never really could transition from his style of defense, which is an 8-man front, into what they needed to do. And I think adding Mike McDonald is a really good add. And so from a scheme standpoint, I think they're going to be much improved defensively. Then they add Ryan Grubb, the college offensive coordinator there at the University of Washington as the offensive coordinator. I think that's going to be a lot of help for them too, because I do think when you break down this team, they have excellent skill players, right? They have Smith and Jigba as a slot receiver, Taylor Lockett, who they redid his contract. Now you add the fact that Charles Cross is going to enter his third season as the starting left tackle. Abraham Lucas is going to be the starting right tackle. Both those players missed a lot of games last year. And then they drafted some offensive linemen. The Haynes kid from UConn's a very good player. I expect him to start. And so this offensive line will be better. And then last year, Kenneth Walker, who you've done a lot of watch Michigan State games, and Charbonnet from UCLA. Those two guys are really good running backs. And they weren't healthy all year. I think, to me, when you look at this team, they have good players offensively. Now let's go defensively, right? They get Murphy, one of the best defensive players in the draft. You know, last year, McDonald, under the guidance of his leadership in Baltimore, was able to get 9.5 sacks from Clowney off the street and 9 sacks from Van Noy off the street in August and September, and they were able to pressure the passer. This secondary is very good. I mean, Weatherspoon's going to be a good player. Woolen's already a good player. Michael Jackson has talent. You know, they can cover, and I think they'll play the right scheme. So this is a team that no one's going to talk about, but I like their team. I like what John Snyder has done. I like the coaching hires. I like the new innovative scheme, and I like the players that they've added. They've lost a lot of players, but I think they can overcome all these losses with what they've done. So to me, I think Seattle's had a good offseason and a good draft.
So with that in mind, as far as the division sits, the 49ers are a minus 195 favorite, followed by the Rams at plus 330. Seattle at 7-1. The Cardinals, the longest shot, at 13-1. Seattle's win total is also sitting at 7.5. If you had to pick, let's just say, and it's obviously so early, so much still to come before we see anybody on the football field. But if you had to like one of those bets more than the other, would you trust Seattle to get 8+ wins, or would you have interest on a long shot flyer at them 7-1 to overcome the 49ers in the division?
Well, I would, as you say, I would put a little pizza money on Seattle to win the division, because let's look at this, right? Seattle last year won 9 games, right? Defensively, they could never stop the run. They were 29th in terms of teams running the football against them attempts. They were 30th in touchdowns allowed. They were 31st in yards allowed. And they played a stadium where it should be really hard to run the ball. With that crowd noise in Seattle, for them not to stop the run is as much to do with scheme, coaching, as it is talent. Because even a bad team, when they play in a dome, can stop the run. It's so loud. Now, I know it's not a dome, but you've been there, Stormy. It's loud, loud, loud. And then when you look at their defensively, they just weren't good defensively at all. They were 25th overall in the league in terms of yards allowed, 30th in points. And I think that's going to improve greatly. And they won 9 games by saying all this with a ton of injuries. So I have a lot more hope for them. I think Geno Smith, whether he's the starter, I like Sam Howell. But I think they won't turn the ball over. They can run the ball this year because they have 2 really good backs. When Walker's healthy, I think he's one of the best backs, in the NFC. I really do. So this is a lot to like about the team because nobody counts them. And I like Pete, but I think there's some things where they got injured and they just couldn't stop anybody on defense. They went that month of, I think it was from November 19th all the way through until the 49er game in December 10th. They just couldn't stop anybody. They're giving up way too many points. Remember the Cowboy game? Look, they went up and down the field on the Cowboys, right? I mean, that was a game on Thursday night. I mean, that's a 41-35 game, and it wasn't decided until late.
Let's stick in the West, but in the AFC, because another team that you wrote about in the article was the Los Angeles Chargers. And you talk about combining not only the coaching staff, but then the offseason and free agency, and then the draft all together. We already know how much you love Jim Harbaugh, and the addition that he's going to bring, and just stylistically what he's going to do, and the physicality and the run game and all of those things. But what else did you like about the Chargers offseason to this point, especially considering they did lose some significant talent because of cap issues?
Well, yeah, they did. But I think what I like the most about them is their ability to toughen up the team, right? Last year, when you break down Brendan Staley was was in charge of the defense, even though he's the head coach. 24th in points allowed, 28th in yards allowed. They couldn't really stop anybody in the passing game. They couldn't rush the passer. They struggled in terms of run defense in the red zone, gave up 26 touchdowns, 26th in the league. Harbaugh is going to bring an element of complete toughness to the team. They are going to be tough. And I think we as executives and handicappers, we tend to overlook the impact of a head coach can have on the team. We so focus on what players here, what players there. When the team is unified and comes together, they're going to run the ball. They're going to be fundamentally sound. And as you talked about with Minnesota, they're going to be able to win some close games because of this. And they're going to make Herbert, which is really the key here. Forget everything else around Herbert's window dressing. If they make Herbert a better player, which is what I believe they're going to do, which is what I've seen Jim do before in his past, if they make him a better player and he starts 17 games and he's able to throw the ball and do the things he's capable of doing, it makes them a much better team already.
Win total for the Chargers coming up this year, 8.5 to make the playoffs, -115 in the division, sitting 3-1. And Michael, a lot of the article was based around teams that you do feel have improved themselves. So I'm curious on the flip side of that. Like, are there any teams that you feel like, perhaps have gotten worse throughout this or have just stayed status quo and aren't teams that you're interested in looking at?
Well, I think the Cowboys hit some really good key elements of their draft. But when you're counting on the draft, and this is the essence of my column, is we get so caught up in the draft, we get so excited about the draft that most of the time these draft picks don't play a lot. And so they're really for next year's draft. And where the Cowboys, they need this draft to really play for them. They need the Guyton kid to start at tackle. They need the BB kid to start at guard or center. They need these things to happen for them to be a good team because they've had no offseason. Did you see the video on Twitter about this kid imitating Zeke? Did you see
him?
No,
I haven't.
This guy's got to be like, oh, it's hilarious. I'll send it to you. But, they signed Zeke back, and I think Zeke's better than people think. He played decently, but they still don't have a runner that you could say, okay, who's replacing Tony Pollard? Remember, 2 years ago, Tony Pollard averaged 10 yards per catch in the passing game. That's a huge element they missed last year. Is that Deuce Vaughn? I don't know. I think, to me, the Cowboys, are they as good as they think they are on defense? I thought they overachieved last year. I didn't think they underachieved. So with a very, very soft offseason, I'm worried about them. And then I'm worried about the Brownies. Brownies were active in free agency. They knew they didn't have draft picks. But my question about the Browns comes down to who's going to play quarterback. Same thing with the Raiders. Who's playing quarterback? Who can lead them to 10 wins in Cleveland? Who can lead the Raiders to 10 wins in Las Vegas?
I'm very curious with the Browns if we've reached the point where Deshaun Watson just is what we see. He's not going to get back to the guy that we thought he was. And that's a scary thought if you're Cleveland, given what you've invested in him. The win total for the Browns, 8.5. Dallas, by the way, win total back up to 10.5, Michael.